The day my mother-in-law needed $500,000, she finally learned who I really was. But by then, it was too late. 25 years of insults, sneers, and humiliation had built a wall between us that no amount of money could break down. My name is Robert Harrison. I'm 67 years old, and for a quarter of a century, Margaret Sullivan treated me like I was dirt beneath her expensive shoes. What she didn't know was that the failure she mocked at every family dinner was the man who could have saved her from complete financial ruin. But would I? It started on a Sunday afternoon in March 2024. Eleanor, my wife of 25 years, called me with urgency in her voice. "Robert, you need to come to Mother's house, now. It's important." There was something in her tone, a trembling quality I hadn't heard since our wedding day, when Margaret had pulled her aside and whispered loud enough for half the church to hear. "It's not too late to change your mind, darling. This man will only drag you down." I drove my old 2008 Honda Civic through the winding roads of Surrey, past the manicured lawns and iron gates of houses that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. Margaret's Victorian mansion stood at the end of Ashworth Lane, its red brick facade and white columns designed to intimidate anyone who approached. It certainly intimidated me the first time I saw it, fresh from my small rented flat in Bristol, wearing my only suit to ask for Eleanor's hand in marriage. That was 1999. I was 42 years old, Eleanor was 17 years younger, and Margaret looked at me like I was a rat that had crawled out of the sewer. "You want to marry my daughter?" she'd said, her voice dripping with contempt. "A man with no family name, no inheritance, no prospects. What exactly do you have to offer Eleanor except a lifetime of mediocrity?" But Eleanor loved me, or at least she said she did. And for 25 years, I held on to that belief, even as Margaret made every family gathering a master class in subtle cruelty. I parked my car next to Margaret's silver Mercedes and Eleanor's BMW. The contrast wasn't lost on me. My Honda had a dent in the passenger door and a scratch across the boot. Inside, I could see Margaret pacing in the drawing room, her silver hair perfectly styled, wearing what looked like a Chanel suit. Eleanor stood by the window, wringing her hands. When I walked in, Margaret didn't even greet me. "You're late," she snapped. "I specifically told Eleanor to have you here by 3 o'clock. "Traffic was bad," I said, keeping my voice neutral. After 25 years, I'd learned that defending myself only gave her more ammunition. "Traffic," Margaret repeated with a bitter laugh. "Of course, a man who drives a car from 2008 probably doesn't know the fastest routes." She turned to Eleanor. "Darling, we really must discuss getting Robert something more appropriate. That vehicle is an embarrassment every time it's seen in this neighborhood." Eleanor flushed. "Mother, that's not why we're here. No, you're quite right." Margaret sat down in her leather armchair like a queen on her throne and gestured for us to sit on the sofa opposite. "We're here because I need your help, both of you." This was new. In 25 years, Margaret Sullivan had never asked me for anything except to stay away from family photographs. "What kind of help?" I asked. Margaret's face tightened, and for the first time, I saw something I'd never seen before. Fear. "I've made some unfortunate investments," she said, the words clearly painful to admit. "My financial advisor, whom I've trusted for 15 years, it seems he's been less than honest about the returns. The properties I thought were appreciating have been sitting empty. The stocks I was assured were blue chip have collapsed, and now the tax authorities are demanding payment on capital gains that I was told had been properly managed." How much do you need? Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. 500,000. Margaret said the number like it was a death sentence. By Friday, if I don't pay, they'll begin seizing assets, the house, the cars, everything. The room went silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. $500,000, £500,000. It might as well have been $500 million for all the chance Margaret had of raising it in 3 days. We'll help, Mother, Eleanor said immediately, looking at me with pleading eyes. Won't we, Robert? This was the moment I'd imagined for years in my darkest fantasies. Margaret Sullivan, the woman who told Eleanor at our wedding reception that I'd trapped her into marriage, who introduced me to her friends as Eleanor's unfortunate choice, who once asked if I'd considered finding work more suited to your capabilities when I mentioned I was between contracts. This woman now needed me. Robert? Eleanor's voice cut through my thoughts. We can help, can't we? We have some savings, and maybe we could take out a loan, or— Let me be clear, Margaret interrupted, her voice regaining some of its usual steel. I'm not asking you for the money, Robert. I'm asking my daughter. You barely make enough to support yourself adequately, let alone contribute to a family emergency. I'm asking Eleanor to access her trust fund. There it was. Even in desperation, Margaret couldn't resist a jab. The truth was, Eleanor's trust fund had been depleted years ago. We'd used it for Thomas's education, for the deposit on our house, for Eleanor's mother's 70th birthday party that cost $30,000, because Margaret insisted her friends see that at least my daughter married above her means in one respect. The trust fund is gone, Mother, Eleanor said softly. We used it years ago for— Gone? Margaret's face went white, then red. You spent your entire inheritance? All 200,000? It was over 10 years, Mother. Thomas's school fees alone were— Thomas could have gone to state school. Margaret stood up, her voice rising. But no, you insisted he needed the best education, the best opportunities. And now, when I need help, when your mother who gave you everything needs you, you tell me the money is gone? She turned to me, her eyes full of venom. This is your doing. You've always been a parasite, living off my daughter's resources. I told her on her wedding day, I said, Eleanor, this man will bleed you dry. And now look at what's happened. Something inside me shifted. For 25 years, I'd kept quiet. For 25 years, I'd let Margaret's words bounce off me, because Eleanor asked me to. Just ignore her, she doesn't mean it. But Eleanor wasn't defending me now. She was looking at the floor, her shoulders slumped, as if she believed her mother might be right. Mrs. Sullivan, I said, my voice calm but firm, I think it's time you and I had an honest conversation. Honest? Margaret laughed bitterly. You? The man who's been playing pretend for 25 years. The man who drives a dented Honda and shops at charity shops. What honesty could possibly come from you? I stood up slowly. The honesty, I said, that you're about to lose everything you've spent your life building. The honesty that your daughter can't help you because we spent that money trying to meet your impossible standards. And the honesty that I could write you a check for $500,000 right now without it affecting my lifestyle in the slightest. The room went deadly silent. Eleanor's head snapped up. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. What did you say? Margaret whispered. You heard me correctly, I said. 500,000. I could transfer it to your account before dinner. But here's what I want you to understand. Every time you called me inadequate, every time you suggested Eleanor deserved better, Every time you made sure I knew I wasn't welcome in your world, I was worth more than you. I've been worth more than you since before I met your daughter." Margaret sat down heavily, her face pale. "You're lying. This is some kind of sick joke." I pulled out my wallet and removed a black credit card. Not the Visa I used for groceries, but the American Express Centurion card I kept hidden. "This card has a $5 million limit," I said, placing it on the coffee table. "Would you like me to call the number on the back so you can verify it with my private banking representative?" Eleanor was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. "Robert, what? I don't understand." "I know you don't, darling." I sat back down, suddenly feeling very tired. "And that's partly my fault, but it's time both of you understood who I really am, and more importantly, who I've been all along while I've been dismissed as not good enough. Have you ever been judged by your appearance, counted out before you'd even begun? Have you ever let someone believe the worst about you because the truth was too complicated to explain? Then you might understand the choice I made 25 years ago when I walked into Margaret Sullivan's mansion and decided not to correct her assumptions about who I was. But now the truth was about to come out, and I wasn't sure any of us were ready for what came next. Margaret's hands were shaking as she picked up the black card, turning it over as if it might be fake. "This is impossible," she said. "Eleanor, your husband works in IT support. He fixes computers for small businesses. How could he possibly—" "I don't work in IT support," I interrupted. "I haven't for 20 years. That was just the story we let you believe because you never asked for details, and Eleanor and I agreed it was easier than trying to explain the truth." "What truth?" Margaret's voice was barely audible. I took a deep breath. This was it, the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating for a quarter of a century. In 1997, 3 years before I met Eleanor, I sold a software company I'd founded to Microsoft. The sale price was $8.4 million. I was 40 years old, newly wealthy, and completely unprepared for what that money would do to my life. Within a year, I'd lost most of my friends, been pursued by gold diggers, and watched my sister's husband try to sue me for a share of the proceeds based on conversations we'd had years earlier about joint business ventures that never existed. Eleanor's face had gone white. "Robert, why didn't you tell me?" "I did tell you," I said gently. "On our third date, I told you I'd had some success in business, but that I preferred to live simply. You said you didn't care about money, that you loved me for who I was. Remember? We were sitting in that cafe in Bath, and you told me your mother would disapprove of anyone you chose because no one was good enough in her eyes. But you didn't tell me you had millions. Would it have mattered?" I asked. "Would it have changed how you felt about me? Because if it would have, then maybe your mother was right to be concerned." The words hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor looked stricken, and even Margaret seemed shaken out of her usual composure. "I made a choice," I continued. "When I met your mother, and she looked at me with such obvious contempt, I decided not to correct her assumptions. I wanted to know if Eleanor's love was real, if our marriage could survive without the cushion of wealth protecting us. And for 25 years, we've lived on my passive income, the dividends and returns from investments that I made back then. That's how we afforded Thomas's school. That's how we paid for this house. That's how we've lived comfortably while everyone assumed I was barely scraping by." Margaret found her voice. "You let me humiliate you. For 25 years, You stood there while I called you inadequate, insufficient, a burden on my daughter, and you said nothing. What would you have preferred? I asked. If I'd told you on day one that I was wealthy, would you have accepted me? Or would you have decided I was trying to impress you, or worse, that I was the kind of man who thought money could buy anything? I don't. For perhaps the first time in her life, Margaret Sullivan was speechless. Let me tell you what would have happened, I said. You would have accepted me on the surface because rejecting a millionaire would make you look foolish. But you would have resented me even more. You would have assumed I was controlling Eleanor with money. You would have suspected every gift, every gesture, every kindness as manipulation. And Eleanor and I would never have had the chance to build a marriage based on something real. So instead you built it on lies? Margaret's voice was sharp. Not lies, omission. There's a difference. I never lied about who I was. I just didn't correct your assumptions about what I had. Eleanor stood up suddenly. I need air, she said, and walked out of the room before either of us could stop her. Margaret and I sat in silence, the black credit card still lying on the coffee table between us like a grenade with the pin pulled. You're not going to help me, are you? Margaret said finally. This is your revenge. You're going to let me lose everything because of how I treated you. Was I? Honestly, I didn't know. Part of me wanted to walk away, to let Margaret Sullivan learn the hard lesson that money can't buy respect and cruelty has consequences. But another part of me, the part that had loved Eleanor for 25 years, knew that destroying her mother would destroy something in my wife, too. I haven't decided yet, I said truthfully. But I think before I do, you and I need to have a longer conversation about the last 25 years. Because if I do help you, Margaret, it won't be because you need the money. It will be because you've finally understood what you've been doing to your daughter by making her choose between her mother's approval and her husband's dignity. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, which shocked me more than anything else that had happened. In 25 years, I'd never seen Margaret Sullivan cry. I was trying to protect her, Margaret whispered. My husband left me when Eleanor was 10. He ran off with his secretary, a woman half his age. I had to rebuild everything, raise Eleanor alone, make sure she had opportunities I never had. And when she brought you home, all I could see was history repeating itself. Another charming man who would take everything and leave. For the first time since I'd met her, I saw Margaret not as the dragon guarding her daughter, but as a frightened woman who'd been hurt and was terrified of watching her child suffer the same pain. But understanding someone's pain doesn't excuse 25 years of cruelty. And as I sat there watching my mother-in-law cry, I knew the decision I had to make would define not just my relationship with Margaret, but my marriage to Eleanor and the kind of man I wanted to be. The question was, which man would I choose to be? I found Eleanor in the garden, standing by Margaret's prized rose bushes, with her arms wrapped around herself despite the mild March afternoon. She didn't turn when she heard my footsteps on the gravel path. 25 years, she said quietly. 25 years, Robert. Were any of them real? I stopped a few feet behind her, giving her space. All of them were real. The money doesn't change who I am, Eleanor. It never did. She turned then, and I saw tears streaming down her face. Doesn't it? How can I know? Every memory I have, every moment we shared, I'm questioning it all now. Were you laughing at us? At me? Watching my mother humiliate you while you knew you could buy and sell everything she had. I never laughed, I said firmly. Not once. Do you know what it's like to be with someone and constantly wonder if they love you or what you can provide? I've watched marriages around me crumble because of money, Eleanor. Too much of it, too little of it, arguments about it. I wanted something different. I wanted something pure. Pure? Her voice rose. You call lying to me for our entire marriage pure? I didn't lie. Omission, yes, I heard your clever justification in there. She gestured angrily toward the house. But it's still deception, Robert. You let me believe we were struggling, that we had to be careful with money. Do you remember 3 years ago when Thomas wanted to go on the school trip to Japan? I told him we couldn't afford it. I watched my son's face fall, and you said nothing. You let him believe we couldn't give him that experience. That one hit hard because she was right. Thomas went the following year, I said quietly, on a better trip with more time to prepare. That's not the point, Eleanor was shouting now, something she rarely did. The point is you watched me make decisions based on information that wasn't true. How many times did I not buy something I wanted because I thought we needed to save? How many times did I feel guilty about spending money when you apparently had millions sitting in the bank? I stepped closer. Eleanor, we've never struggled. Yes, I let you believe we needed to be careful, but look at our life. We live in a beautiful house in a good neighborhood. Thomas went to the best school in Bristol. We go on holidays. You drive a BMW. When have you ever actually gone without something you needed? That's not the point either, and you know it. She wiped her eyes roughly. The point is trust, Robert. The foundation of everything we built was trust, and now I'm finding out it was all sand. Before I could respond, Margaret appeared at the garden door. Her makeup was slightly smudged. Another thing I'd never seen, evidence of the tears she'd shed. Eleanor, darling, please come inside. We need to discuss this as a family. A family? Eleanor laughed bitterly. Which family? The one where my husband is a modest IT worker and we budget carefully for everything? Or the one where he's secretly a millionaire and I'm just too stupid to notice? You're not stupid, I said, but Eleanor had already walked past me toward the house. Margaret and I followed her back into the drawing room. The black credit card still sat on the coffee table, a small piece of plastic that had somehow managed to detonate 25 years of carefully maintained pretense. Eleanor sat down in the chair her mother had vacated, leaving Margaret and me to take the sofa. It felt wrong, this reversal, as if Eleanor was now the judge and we were the accused. I need to understand, Eleanor said, her voice more controlled now. From the beginning, everything. I took a deep breath. I founded a software company called Data Stream Solutions in 1994. We specialized in database management systems for medium-sized businesses. It was just me and 2 university friends at first, working out of a garage in Bristol. By 1997, we had 50 employees and contracts with major UK corporations. Microsoft was expanding its enterprise software division and made us an offer, $8.4 million for the company and all the intellectual property. $8.4 million. Eleanor repeated numbly. In 1997, I gave my 2 partners $1.5 million each and kept $5.4 million. After taxes and fees, I was left with about $3.8 million in 1998. I invested it conservatively, mostly in index funds, property, and some individual stocks. Over 26 years, with compound interest and reinvestment, that portfolio has grown to approximately $12.4 million. The number seemed to physically impact Eleanor. She gripped the arms of the chair. $12 million pounds. But here's what you need to understand, I continued. After I sold the company, everything changed. Friends I'd known for years suddenly needed loans. My sister's husband sued me, claiming I'd promised him a share. Women I'd never met started appearing at my flat, introduced by mutual friends who thought we'd be perfect for each other. I became a target, Eleanor, not a person, but a bank account with legs. I leaned forward, willing her to understand. So, I did what I thought was smart. I moved to a modest flat, drove an ordinary car, lived like I had before the sale. And I was miserable, lonely, suspicious of everyone, until I met you. At the bookshop, Eleanor said quietly. You were browsing the history section. You were reaching for a book on the top shelf and couldn't quite get it. I helped you down with it. We started talking about Victorian industrial history. You invited me for coffee. And you lied to me from day one. I didn't lie, I insisted. On our third date, when things were getting serious, I told you I'd had some success in business, but preferred a simple life. You said, and I remember your exact words. Thank God. I'm so tired of men who think money and success are personality traits. Eleanor's face flushed. I did say that, didn't I? I was thinking of Robert Chambers, Mother's friend's son. He talked about his salary within 5 minutes of meeting me. Dreadful man. Margaret interjected, speaking for the first time since we'd come back inside. Married 3 times, always to younger women who spent his money. I never seriously considered him for Eleanor. The point is, I continued, you told me money wasn't important to you. So I tested that. I didn't flaunt wealth. I didn't try to impress you with expensive gifts. And you fell in love with me anyway. That meant everything, Eleanor. Don't you see? You loved me for who I was, not what I had. But who are you, really? Eleanor asked. Because the man I thought I married would never deceive me for 25 years. The man I thought I married would trust me with the truth. That stung because she was right. I'm the same man, I said quietly. I'm the man who makes you tea every morning, just the way you like it. The man who rubs your feet when they hurt. The man who sat with you all night when Thomas had pneumonia. The money doesn't change any of that. But it changes everything else. Eleanor looked at her mother. You spent 25 years humiliating him, making snide comments about his car, his clothes, his job. And he let you. Why, Robert? If you were protecting me from some truth, why put yourself through that torture? This was the question I'd known was coming. Because, I said slowly, I wanted to know if your love could survive your mother's disapproval, and if your mother would ever learn to respect someone for their character rather than their bank balance. Margaret flinched as if I'd struck her. That's quite an experiment, Eleanor said coldly. Using us like lab rats to test your theories about human nature. It wasn't like that, wasn't it? She stood up, pacing now. You know what I remember from our wedding day? My mother pulling me aside and saying you weren't good enough, that I was making a terrible mistake. And do you know what I said to her? I shook my head. I said, Mother, Robert is the kindest, most genuine man I've ever met. He's not rich, and he's not from our social circle, but he loves me for me, and that's worth more than all the money in the world. I defended you, Robert, against my mother, against her friends, against everyone who said I was settling. And all that time, you were rich. You were always rich. You just let me think I was being brave and independent by choosing love over money when there was never any choice at all. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and they were an accusation, justified and painful. "Eleanor," Margaret said softly, surprising us both, "I need to say something, and I need you both to hear it." She took a shaky breath. "I was wrong. About Robert. About everything. For 25 years I've treated this man with contempt because I was terrified. Terrified that history would repeat itself, that you'd be hurt the way I was hurt. But in protecting you from a danger that didn't exist, I failed to see the danger I was creating." Eleanor turned to her mother. "What are you talking about?" "I drove a wedge between you and your husband," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "Every snide comment, every put-down, every time I made Robert feel less than, I was telling you that your choice was wrong. And you defended him, darling. You always defended him. But I made you work so hard for it. I made you question yourself. And now I've learned that the man I spent 25 years disparaging is the one person who could save me from losing everything." She turned to me. "You asked earlier why I treated you the way I did. The truth is, Robert, you scared me. You made Eleanor happier than I'd ever seen her, and that happiness made her independent. She didn't need me anymore. She had you. And I couldn't stand it. So I spent 25 years trying to prove you weren't good enough, hoping that one day Eleanor would see what I saw and come back to me." "Mother," Eleanor's voice was soft. "But you never saw it," Margaret continued, "because it was never there. You saw a good man who loved you, and I was too blind and too frightened to admit it." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of that damned grandfather clock. 3 people, bound by marriage and blood, and 25 years of complicated history, trying to find a way forward. "I need time," Eleanor said finally. "I need time to process this, all of it. Mother's prejudice, Robert's deception, my own willful blindness. I can't make any decisions right now." "The tax authorities need an answer by Friday," Margaret said quietly. 3 days. "Then you'll have our answer in 3 days," Eleanor said. "But right now, I need to be alone." She walked out of the room, and a moment later we heard the front door close and her BMW start up. Margaret and I sat in silence for a long moment. "She's going to leave me," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. Margaret looked at me with eyes that were, for the first time since I'd met her, kind. "No, she won't. Eleanor is many things, but she's not a quitter. And despite what you might think, she's her father's daughter, not mine. She values loyalty and honesty above everything. That's why this hurts her so much." "I never meant to hurt her." "I know. But intention doesn't negate impact, Robert. You should know that. I certainly should have learned it decades ago." She stood up slowly, looking every one of her 72 years. "I'm going to make tea. Would you like some?" It was such a mundane question after such a dramatic afternoon that I almost laughed. "Yes, please." In the kitchen, as Margaret moved through the familiar ritual of filling the kettle and setting out cups, she said, "You asked me why I treated you the way I did. Can I tell you the real reason?" "Please." "You reminded me of my husband, not in looks or manner, but in the way Eleanor looked at you. She looked at you the way I used to look at James before I knew what he was capable of. That adoration, that complete trust. And I knew with absolute certainty that you were going to break her heart the way James broke mine. So I tried to break you first, to drive you away before you could hurt her. But I never wanted to hurt her. No, you just wanted to protect yourself. I understand that now. We're not so different, you and I. We both spent 25 years trying to protect ourselves and Eleanor, and in doing so, We nearly destroyed the thing we were trying to preserve. The kettle whistled. Margaret poured the tea with steady hands. "Will you help me?" she asked, not looking at me. "With the money?" "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "It's not about revenge, Margaret. It's about, I need to know if you've learned anything from this. Because if I help you, and tomorrow you go back to treating me like I'm beneath you, then what was the point?" "Fair enough." She handed me a cup of tea. I suppose I deserve that. We sat at her kitchen table, drinking tea, two people who'd been enemies for a quarter century, now trying to figure out if they could be something else. "Tell me about Thomas," Margaret said suddenly. "Tell me something I don't know about my grandson." It was an olive branch, small and tentative. "He wants to be a teacher," I said. "Not a doctor or lawyer like you hoped, a primary school teacher. He loves working with young children, makes him feel like he's making a real difference." Margaret's eyes filled with tears again. "A teacher? That's wonderful. Does Eleanor know?" "She knows. She supports him, but he's terrified to tell you because he thinks you'll be disappointed." "I've made such a mess of things, haven't I?" Margaret whispered. "With all of you." "Yes," I said gently. "But messes can be cleaned up, if people are willing to do the work." She looked at me for a long moment. "Are you willing, Robert, to do the work?" "Because I am. For the first time in 25 years, I'm ready to try." I thought about Eleanor, driving somewhere to process this revelation. About Thomas, worried about disappointing his grandmother. About Margaret, facing financial ruin and the collapse of her carefully constructed world. About myself and the man I wanted to be versus the man I'd become by hiding behind my wealth. "I'll give you my answer on Friday," I said. "The same day you need the money, but between now and then, I want you to do something for me. Anything. I want you to spend time with Thomas, really spend time with him. Listen to him talk about teaching, ask him about his dreams, and I want you to do it without mentioning his future, or what he should do, or what would be best for his career. Just listen to who he is, not who you want him to be." Margaret nodded slowly. "I can do that." "Then we'll talk again on Friday." The next 3 days felt like walking through a minefield blindfolded. Eleanor came home Monday night, but slept in the guest room. Tuesday morning, she left for work without saying goodbye. By Tuesday afternoon, I was beginning to wonder if Margaret was right. Maybe Eleanor wouldn't leave, but maybe she wouldn't stay either. Maybe we'd end up in that peculiar purgatory of couples who share a house but not a life. Thomas knew something was wrong. At 16, he was perceptive enough to notice his mother's red eyes and his father's careful distance, but wise enough not to ask direct questions. Instead, on Tuesday evening, he asked if he could go stay with his grandmother for a few days. "Your grandmother?" I said, surprised. In 16 years, Thomas had never voluntarily asked to stay at Margaret's house. She'd always been grandmother to him, formal, distant, occasionally generous, but never warm. "She called me," Thomas said, not meeting my eyes. "Said she wanted to spend some time together, asked if I'd like to stay over, maybe help her in the garden. It was weird, actually. She's never asked before." I remembered my request to Margaret. Spend time with Thomas, really listen to him, so she was trying. "I think that's a wonderful idea," I said. "Your mother might appreciate the space anyway." Thomas looked up sharply. "Are you and Mum getting divorced?" "No," I said firmly, then more honestly. At least I hope not. We're going through something difficult right now, but we love each other, Thomas. That hasn't changed. But something else has changed, he said. It wasn't a question. Smart kid. Yes, something has changed, and your mother and I need to figure out what to do about it. He nodded slowly. Okay, I'll pack a bag. As I watched him head upstairs, I wondered if I was doing the right thing, sending him to Margaret's house during this crisis. But then I remembered the look in Margaret's eyes when I'd suggested she spend time with her grandson. Maybe this was good for both of them. Wednesday morning, Margaret called me. Robert, I need your help with something. Can you come over? When I arrived, I found Margaret and Thomas in the garden, both wearing muddy gloves and working on the rose bushes. Thomas looked more relaxed than I'd seen him in months. Mr. Harrison, Margaret said, and I almost laughed. She'd never called me Mr. Harrison. It had always been Robert, said with faint distaste, or more often not addressing me directly at all. Thomas and I were discussing university options. He tells me he's interested in education studies. Thomas shot me a panicked look. Here it comes, his face said. Here's where she tells me I'm wasting my potential. But Margaret just smiled. I think that's marvelous. Did you know my father was a teacher? Secondary school mathematics. He always said it was the most rewarding job he ever had, watching young minds discover things for the first time. Thomas's mouth fell open. I didn't know that. No, I don't suppose you did. I spent so many years focusing on what I thought success should look like that I forgot to tell you about what success actually looked like in my own family. She turned to me. Robert, would you mind helping Thomas and me move some paving stones? We're creating a new pathway, but they're rather heavy. For the next hour, I worked alongside my mother-in-law and son, moving stones and listening to Margaret tell stories I'd never heard. Stories about her father, the teacher, her mother, the nurse, her grandmother who ran a small bakery during the war. A family history of service and care, not wealth and status. Why are you telling me all this now, Gran? Thomas asked at one point. Gran. He'd called her Gran, not grandmother. When had that shift happened? Because, Margaret said carefully, I've spent too long forgetting where I came from. My husband, your grandfather, he came from money. Old money, family money. And when I married him, I thought I had to become something different to fit into his world. I thought I had to value the things his family valued. And then when he left, she paused, her voice thick. When he left, I was so determined to prove I belonged in that world that I lost sight of who I really was. She looked at me. Your father tried to remind me. All these years, living simply, not flaunting his success. He was trying to show me that worth isn't measured in pounds and pence. But I couldn't see it. Wouldn't see it. Dad? Thomas looked at me, confused. What is she talking about? This was it. The moment I had to tell my son that everything he thought he knew about his father's circumstances was incomplete. Thomas, there are some things I need to explain to you about our family finances, about choices I made before you were born. We sat on Margaret's garden bench, and I told my son the abbreviated version, the software company, the sale, the decision to live modestly. I watched his face go through the same journey Eleanor's had, shock, confusion, betrayal, and finally, reluctant understanding. So we're rich? Was his first question. Like, actually rich? Comfortable, I said. Very comfortable. But you never told me. You let me think we had to budget for everything. We did budget, I said. Just because we have money doesn't mean we should waste it. I wanted you to learn the value of things, Thomas. To understand that satisfaction doesn't come from what you buy, but from what you build. He was quiet for a long time. Is that why Mum's upset? Because you didn't tell her either? Your mother's upset because I kept something important from her. She has every right to be. But you were trying to protect yourself, Margaret interjected, from people who might only want you for your money. That's understandable, isn't it, Thomas? Thomas looked between us. I guess, but Mum's not like that. She loves Dad for who he is. Exactly, Margaret said, which is why this hurts her so much. She proved herself for 25 years, and your father still didn't trust her with the truth. She said it gently, but the words landed like stones. Because she was absolutely right. What are you going to do? Thomas asked me. I don't know yet, I admitted. Your grandmother needs help with something by Friday, something expensive, and I'm trying to decide if helping her is the right thing to do. Thomas looked at Margaret, who suddenly seemed very interested in her roses. Is it about money? He asked. Yes, Margaret said quietly. I made some bad financial decisions, and now I'm facing consequences. Your father could help me, but after the way I've treated him, I wouldn't blame him if he refused. Thomas stood up abruptly. That's stupid. We both stared at him. I'm sorry, Gran, but it is. If Dad can help you and he doesn't, he's just being petty. And if you're expecting him not to help because of how you treated him, then you're both playing games instead of acting like family. Out of the mouths of babes, as they say, or in this case, 16-year-olds who'd apparently inherited their mother's ability to cut through nonsense. You're right, I said. But it's not quite that simple, Thomas. Why not? He challenged. Either helping Gran is the right thing to do, or it isn't. How she treated you before doesn't change whether it's right. It just changes whether it feels good. Margaret's eyes were shining with tears. When did you get so wise? Probably from having a teacher for a great-grandfather, Thomas said, grinning. They pass down wisdom through generations, you know. We all laughed, and for a moment, it felt like maybe things could be okay. Not the same, but okay. That evening, I came home to find Eleanor sitting in our living room, still in her work clothes, holding a cup of tea that had clearly gone cold. Thomas called me, she said without preamble. Told me about the conversation you all had, about Margaret's stories and his great-grandfather. He's a good kid, I said carefully. He's a wonderful kid. She set down the cup. Robert, I've been thinking about something. Do you remember our 10th anniversary? I nodded. We'd gone to Brighton for the weekend, stayed in a modest B&B, walked along the pier. You wanted to stay at the Grand Hotel, Eleanor continued. You showed me the brochure, but I said it was too expensive, that we should save the money for Thomas's future. And you agreed. Do you remember what you said? I did. I remembered exactly. I said, the hotel doesn't matter. What matters is the time with you. Right. And I felt so loved in that moment. I felt like you really understood that experiences aren't about luxury. They're about connection. She looked at me. But you could have afforded the Grand Hotel, couldn't you? You could have afforded 10 Grand Hotels. Yes. So why didn't you book it anyway? Why did you let me think we were being frugal when you could have given me that experience? This was the heart of it, the question beneath all the other questions. Because, I said slowly, I wanted you to choose me over the luxury. I wanted to know that a weekend in a B&B with me was better than a fancy hotel with someone else. But I never had someone else. Eleanor's voice rose. There was never a comparison to make. I chose you, Robert. On our third date, I chose you. On our wedding day, I chose you. Every day for 25 years, I chose you. When was it going to be enough? When were you going to trust that my choice was real? I had no answer, because she was right. No answer would have ever been enough. I'd been so damaged by my experiences after selling the company that I'd spent 25 years testing Eleanor's love instead of trusting it. "I'm sorry," I said. It was inadequate, but it was true. "I'm so sorry, Eleanor." She wiped her eyes. "Mother called me today. Did you know that?" I shook my head. "She told me she was wrong about you, that she'd spent 25 years being wrong. She said you were the best thing that ever happened to me, and she'd been too blind to see it." Eleanor laughed shakily. 25 years I waited to hear those words from her, and now that I have, I don't know what to do with them. "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I want to go back to Sunday afternoon and pretend none of this happened. I want to unknow what I know now." She stood up, pacing. "But I can't. So instead, I need to figure out if I can build something new with a man who didn't trust me enough to be honest." "Eleanor? No, let me finish." She stopped in front of me. "Here's what I'm thinking. You helped Thomas today. You went to Mother's house, worked in her garden, told our son the truth. That took courage. And Mother spent time with Thomas, really spent time with him, for the first time since he was born. That took courage, too. So maybe if you're both brave enough to change, I can be brave enough to forgive." Hope bloomed in my chest. "Does that mean?" "It means I'm willing to try, to really try, not just go through the motions. But Robert, this can't happen again. No more secrets, no more tests, no more protecting yourself at the expense of our marriage." "I promise," I said. "No more secrets." She studied my face for a long moment. "Okay, then I have a question for you. Are you going to help Mother?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to, but part of me is afraid that if I do, she'll go back to treating me the way she always has. And if she does, then I'll have proven that people can't change, that all this pain was for nothing." Eleanor sat down next to me. "Or," she said, "you'll have proven that you're a bigger person than the hurt you've experienced, that you can choose kindness even when it's hard." She took my hand. "I can't tell you what to do, Robert, but I can tell you this. The man I fell in love with 25 years ago, the one I thought was struggling but kind, would help her, because that man believed in doing the right thing even when it cost him something." "And what about the man who has 12.4 million?" I asked. "What would he do?" She smiled, a real smile for the first time since Sunday. "I don't know him yet, but I'm hoping he's the same man, just with a bigger bank account." We sat there holding hands, not quite healed but starting to mend. And I thought about Margaret spending time with Thomas, about Thomas calling her Gran, about Eleanor choosing to forgive instead of flee, about myself and the choice I had to make by Friday. Outside, the sun was setting over Bristol. In Margaret's house in Surrey, Thomas was probably having dinner with his grandmother, learning stories about a family history he'd never known. And somewhere in my mind, I was beginning to understand that trust isn't something you test, it's something you give, even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared. Friday was 2 days away. By then, I'd need to have an answer, not just for Margaret, but for myself. because this wasn't really about $500,000. It was about the kind of man I wanted to be and the kind of family we wanted to create from the ruins of the one we'd thought we had. Think about the people in your own life who've had to choose between justified anger and undeserved grace. It's never an easy choice. But sometimes it's the only choice that leads anywhere worth going. Friday arrived with gray skies and the threat of rain, which felt appropriate for a day that could either rebuild a family or shatter it completely. Margaret's deadline was 5 p.m. By 5:01, if she didn't have $500,000 in her account, the tax authorities would begin seizing assets. Her house, her car, everything she'd spent her life building would be gone. I woke early, made tea for Eleanor, who'd moved back into our bedroom Wednesday night, and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. My private banking app showed the balance clearly. $12,437,392.76. More than enough to solve Margaret's problem. More than enough to buy forgiveness, if forgiveness could be bought. But that was the question, wasn't it? Could it be bought, or did it have to be earned? Eleanor came downstairs in her dressing gown, hair still mussed from sleep. "Have you decided?" she asked, pouring herself coffee. "Not yet," I admitted. "I keep running through scenarios. If I help her, does it enable her behavior? Does it teach her that cruelty has no consequences? But if I don't help her, am I just being vindictive? Using my money as a weapon the same way she used her words?" Eleanor sat across from me. "Can I tell you something I've never told you?" I nodded. 3 years after we got married, Mother pulled me aside at Christmas. She said, "Eleanor, I'll give you $50,000 right now if you leave him. Just leave. Start over. Find someone worthy of you." Eleanor's eyes were distant, remembering. I told her to go to hell, used those exact words. We didn't speak for 6 months. "I never knew that," I said, feeling a surge of love for this woman who defended me even when I hadn't known I needed defending. "She tried to buy me away from you," Eleanor continued, "and it didn't work because love isn't a transaction. But Robert, here's what I realized last night. If you give her this money to prove you're better than her, you're making it a transaction too. You're buying moral superiority. So what should I do?" She reached across the table and took my hand. "Help her, because it's right. Not because it proves anything or teaches anything or changes anything. Just because it's right. Simple, devastating, true." At 9 a.m., I called Margaret. "Can you come to my office?" I asked. "All of you. You, Eleanor, and Thomas. I'd like to discuss this as a family." My office was in Bristol city center, on the top floor of a building overlooking the harbor. It was the one piece of my old life I'd maintained, a place where I managed my investments and occasionally consulted for tech companies. Eleanor had never been there. Neither had Margaret or Thomas. They arrived at 10 a.m., Margaret driving her Mercedes with Eleanor and Thomas as passengers. I watched from the window as they got out, Margaret looking around uncertainly, Eleanor pointing up at my building with something like shock on her face. My assistant, James, who'd been with me for 15 years and knew everything, showed them into the conference room. When I walked in, they were all staring at the view, at the expensive furniture, at the Bloomberg terminal in the corner. "You work here?" Thomas asked. "This is your office?" "I own the company 3 floors down," I said. "This is where I manage my investments and consult. I usually come in twice a week." Eleanor was very quiet, taking it all in. This was my secret life, laid bare, not hidden in a bank account, but visible in glass and steel and harbor views. Margaret spoke first. "I owe you all an apology, a real one, not just words." She looked at each of us in turn. "For 25 years I've been cruel. I told myself it was protection, but it was cowardice. I was terrified of being hurt again, so I hurt first. I hurt Robert, and in doing so, I hurt Eleanor. I hurt Thomas by teaching him that love was conditional on achievement. I hurt all of you." She pulled out an envelope from her handbag. "This is a letter I wrote last night. It's for my tax advisors, instructing them to begin asset liquidation proceedings. I've decided not to ask Robert for help." "Mother," Eleanor started, but Margaret held up her hand. "Let me finish. Robert, you offered to help if I proved I'd changed. But change isn't something you prove in 3 days. It's something you work at for years. You and Eleanor need time to rebuild your marriage without me as a burden. And I need to face the consequences of my choices. I've spent my life believing money equaled worth. Maybe losing it all will teach me what worth really is." The room was silent except for the distant sound of traffic below. This was Margaret Sullivan, who'd spent 25 years defining herself by her possessions, her status, her ability to look down on others. And she was choosing to lose it all rather than accept help she didn't think she deserved. Thomas was crying quietly. Eleanor looked stunned, and I felt something shift inside me, like a door opening that I'd kept locked for decades. "No," I said. Margaret looked up, confused. "No?" I opened my laptop and pulled up my banking app. $500,000, you said, to be transferred by 5 p.m. today. "Robert, I can't accept." "You're right," I interrupted. "You can't accept it because I'm not giving it to you." I turned the screen so everyone could see it. "I'm transferring $1 million to your account. $500,000 is for the tax bill. The other $500,000 is for you to donate to a charity of your choice, but not as Margaret Sullivan, as someone anonymous, someone who gives because it's right, not because it brings recognition." Margaret's face crumpled. "I don't understand. Why would you do this after everything I've done?" "Because," I said, "my son was right. Either helping you is the right thing to do, or it isn't. And it is. Not because you've earned it, or because I want to prove something, but because you're family. Broken, complicated, difficult family. But family nonetheless." I looked at Eleanor, who was smiling through tears. "I spent 25 years protecting myself from people who might only want me for my money. And in doing so, I missed the point entirely. The right people don't want you for your money. They want you despite your money. They want you when you're broke or rich, successful or struggling, perfect or deeply flawed. Eleanor wanted me when she thought I drove a dented Honda. Thomas loves me whether I can afford university or not. And Margaret," I turned to my mother-in-law, "you're finally seeing me as a person rather than a bank account precisely when you're no longer asking for money. That's when I know this is real." Margaret was sobbing now, the kind of crying that comes from years of walls finally breaking down. Thomas got up and hugged his grandmother, and Eleanor moved to hold them both. I pulled out my phone and called my bank. "Yes, this is Robert Harrison, account number 472191. I need to make an immediate transfer of $1 million to the following account." I read out Margaret's details while she shook her head in disbelief. "It's done," I said after confirming the transfer. "You'll see it in your account within the hour. $500,000 for the tax bill, $500,000 for charity. I trust you to make good choices with both." Margaret stood up shakily and walked over to me. For 25 years, we'd never embraced. We'd barely touched except for the most formal of handshakes. Now she pulled me into a hug, and I felt how thin she'd become, how much this crisis had taken from her. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being better than I deserved." "We're all better than we deserve, sometimes," I said. "That's what grace is." 6 months later, our family looks different. Not perfect, but different. Margaret sold her Victorian mansion and moved to a smaller cottage in Bath. She volunteers 3 days a week at a women's shelter, using her experience with financial mismanagement to help women rebuild their lives after escaping abuse. The $500,000 I gave her went to that same shelter, anonymous as requested, the largest donation they'd ever received. Thomas started university studying education. Margaret attends his football matches and sends him care packages with homemade biscuits. She's learning to be the grandmother she never allowed herself to be, and he's learning that people can change when they're brave enough to try. Eleanor and I started marriage counseling. It's not easy, working through 25 years of half-truths and unspoken expectations. Some days are harder than others, but we're learning to be honest in ways we never were before. I've opened all my financial accounts to her. She's opened all her feelings to me. It turns out complete transparency is both terrifying and liberating. Last week, we went to Brighton for our 25th anniversary. This time, I booked the Grand Hotel. The honeymoon suite overlooking the sea, with champagne and roses and everything I could have given her decades ago but didn't. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, looking out at the sunset from our balcony. "Do you wish I'd done this years ago?" I asked. She thought about it. "No," she said finally, "because if you'd done it years ago, it would have been about the money. Now it's about us, about choosing to celebrate what we've survived and what we're building." She was right. Again. She's right about a lot of things, my wife. Margaret calls every Sunday now, not to ask for anything, just to talk. She tells us about the women at the shelter, about her garden, about books she's reading. Sometimes she apologizes again for the past. I tell her the past is past. She's learning to believe me. I've also changed. I've stopped hiding. I've introduced Eleanor to my business associates, invited her to board meetings, shown her the full scope of what I do. She's brilliant with strategy, turns out. Much better than I am. She might join me as a partner soon. Equal partners in business as in life. Thomas knows the truth now about our finances, but he's also learned that money is a tool, not a purpose. He wants to be a teacher because he wants to make a difference, not despite what he could earn elsewhere, but because of it. Last month, Margaret, Eleanor, Thomas, and I all volunteered together at the women's shelter. We painted walls, organized donations, listened to stories of survival. At one point, I looked around at my family, my wife measuring curtains, my son playing with a resident's children, my mother-in-law counseling a woman on rebuilding credit. And I thought, this is what wealth looks like. Not the money in my accounts, but this. People using their resources, their time, their experiences to help others. Margaret caught my eye and smiled. A real smile, warm and genuine, without a trace of the contempt I'd seen for 25 years. And I smiled back, no longer defensive or protective, just glad. Because here's what I've learned. You can't buy respect, you can't purchase love, and you can't bribe your way into belonging. But you can choose grace over grudges. You can choose growth over grievances. You can choose to be the person who breaks cycles instead of perpetuating them. I spent 25 years testing Eleanor's love, and it took almost losing her to realize that love isn't meant to be tested. It's meant to be trusted, given freely, received gratefully, and protected fiercely. Margaret spent 25 years protecting herself from pain, and it took almost losing everything to realize that the walls we build to keep out hurt also keep out healing. Eleanor spent 25 years defending me, and it took one revelation to realize that true love means holding people accountable, not just holding them close. And Thomas? Thomas is teaching all of us that wisdom sometimes comes from the mouths of teenagers who haven't yet learned to complicate simple truths. So here we are, a family rebuilt from the ruins of the one we thought we had. Not perfect, still learning, still growing, but real in ways we never were before. The question I asked myself that Friday morning was, what kind of man did I want to be? The answer turned out to be simpler than I thought. I wanted to be the kind of man who chose kindness even when it was hard, who chose family even when it was complicated, who chose grace even when judgment would have felt more satisfying. Because at the end of the day, we're all just people trying to get it right, making mistakes, hurting each other, learning to do better. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get the chance to prove that change is possible, that forgiveness is real, that families can heal. Margaret needed $500,000 that day. But what she really needed, what we all needed, was the chance to start over, to rebuild on honest foundations instead of hidden ones, to be seen for who we really are, warts and all, and to be loved anyway. Money can solve a lot of problems, but it can't solve the problem of disconnection, of dishonesty, of walls built so high that love can't climb over them. Only people can solve those problems. Only courage and honesty and the willingness to be vulnerable, even when it's terrifying. I don't know what the next 25 years will bring for our family. I hope they bring continued healing. I hope Margaret keeps growing into the grandmother Thomas deserves. I hope Eleanor and I keep learning how to be truly honest with each other. I hope Thomas becomes the teacher he wants to be, and that he builds a life of purpose rather than profit. But whatever comes, I know this. I won't hide anymore. Not behind money, not behind tests, not behind walls of self-protection, because the richest life I can imagine isn't one where I have $12 million in the bank. It's one where I have people who know all of me, the generous and the scared, the strong and the wounded, and choose to stay anyway. That's the real wealth, and it's worth more than any amount of money I'll ever have. If you've ever had to choose between justified anger and undeserved grace, if you've ever kept a secret that protected you but hurt someone you loved, if you've ever watched someone change and wondered if it was real or if it would last, then you know how complicated family can be. Drop a comment below and tell us, would you have helped Margaret? And what's your story of choosing grace over grudges? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our daily stories of real people facing impossible choices. Your story might be next. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about your own family relationships, consider leaving a super thanks. It helps us create more stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our community.